All right, so in this tutorial, we're going to be going over UV unwrapping a teapot. So there's some different shapes on the teapot, so I figured this would be a really good example to go over different unwrapping tools. In this one, we're going to be using a number of projection methods, but we're not going to be touching the UVW map modifier at all because it's kind of a bad practice to use that. It's something that we see a lot with our offshore models. So we basically want to instill some really good best practices as far as it comes to manually unwrapping our models. So if you open up UV teapot begin, the scene should look something like this. I purposely left my camera and my dome light in here because I wanted to go over just turning those things off if they're in the way. And it's a little bit easier than just going to our scene outliner or our scene explorer and just turning those off individually. I figured it would be easier if we had a bunch of lights in here. We could go to our display panel and just uncheck lights and cameras for the time being just to get them out of the way. All right, so if we look at this teapot, there's really nothing special, standard primitive, set to a certain size. And the first thing I'm going to do is up the segments a little bit, because when we're unwrapping something like this, sometimes it's easier to work with something that has a little bit more geometry rather than something that's super low poly. And then when we add a turbo smooth, it starts to stretch the UVs. We can go over some examples of that in later lessons. All right, so in your material editor, if you open that up, I have a material already set up for you. It's pretty basic. It's just a checker map. And it's a little bit better than using a standard checker map in the maps panel because we can see numbers and actually tell if something is stretching rather than just seeing standard checker boxes and kind of still guessing at the proportions. So typically, if you're just kind of quickly checking something, you can increase the checker amount on this and apply it to our model. But honestly, I prefer to use the checker map that's in this scene. And this is also, it will obviously be provided, but you could use any map that you want. All right, so I'm going to assign this to my model. And we can see that the UVs are kind of already laid out decently. Let me turn off, okay. So they're kind of laid out decently here, and there's a few stretching areas going on, but we'll actually see what's going on when we open up the UVW, the unwrapped UVW. Created the wrong one there. So unwrapped UVW is the one we're going to be working with. And if we look at the seams, these green lines here are the seams that are already pre-cut on our model. So we have like two seams going up and down the spout here. We have some crazy seams all over the place. I mean, it's laid out very specifically so that these tile in a specific manner, but there's some better ways of doing this. So immediately I'm going to open up my UV editor and I'm going to take a look at the teapot UVs, and we can see like everything's very uniform. Everything's laid out pretty nicely, but things aren't connected where they should be. One thing to note real quick is since this is a standard primitive, we have these triangular lines going through, and you'll see this with editable meshes and also just any standard primitive that you've created through Max. So I'm going to close out the UV editor real quick. I'm going to delete this, and we can either add a edit poly on top and not change anything, or we can just convert this to an editable poly. I already know that the segments and size are what I want, so I don't really need to go back to the previous iteration. So I'm going to create an unwrapped UVW again. And now when we open up the UV editor and we select our faces, we won't have those triangular lines cutting through. Cool. So let's start by resetting the entire thing. So I'm going to expand this modify panel here, and I'm working on a little bit of a smaller screen space than some of the larger monitors that the artists use, but that's fine. So we'll make do. So let's see, let's start with a projection. So typically in my workflow, I like to just do a standard projection on my entire model because I kind of want to reset the UVs more often than not. So I'm just going to do a planar projection, and I'm going to do it in the Y direction. So it's essentially just taking our model and basically doing a planar projection across the entire thing. So we're going to get some stretching along this side because it's saying, okay, look at the side of it and just project perfectly so that no matter what angle, it's going to actually stretch this checker along that edge at grazing angle. Now, when you're working with UVs, a good thing to know is you can hit F2 to turn off face highlight. So if I hit F2, I can actually see a little bit easier of what's going on. It'll make things a little bit easier to see. Cool. So I'm going to open up my UV editor again, and I'm going to go full screen. So let's start taking a look at this guy. So there's different elements. Each element is broken up just like it would be on the model. So this handle is a different element, and this spout is a different element, and the top's a different element. Since all of these are separate pieces to begin with, they're separate UV islands within our UV editor already. So I like to separate them out, and I like to work with one piece at a time. So the first thing I'm going to focus on is the base here, the belly of our teapot. And I'm going to kind of separate things out here so I can see a little bit better, because I want you to see the teapot as I make these edits. So I'm going to scroll down to my projection method, and I'm going to use cylindrical because we have a cylindrical surface to work with right now. Because now I'm going to create this cylindrical map based around my entire pot. So I need to select the align option because obviously it's not correct. We can try fit, but obviously it's still not in the right direction. So I'm going to hit the Z direction since it's up and down, and that will project perfectly around my model here. So I'm going to turn off my projection method, and now I'm going to manually edit these. One thing to note is we get these weird cuts in seams here. That's pretty typical when you do a projection method like this for a cylindrical map. So I'm going to select these edges, and all of our hotkeys apply here. So we can hit 1 for vertices, 2 for edges, and 3 for polygons, as long as this keyboard shortcut override toggle is activated. So keep that in mind. I can't remember if it's on by default or not, but I have noticed on some computers that it's off, and it gets a little screwed up because your hotkeys won't work in certain menu sets. Cool, so I have to turn off select by element UV toggle and go to edge mode, and I'm going to select all of these edges along this piece here where they're connected. They're right on top of each other, but honestly they're separated, so it doesn't make sense. I just want to kind of weld those together. So we're going to use the weld tool. So I can go to weld selected subobject, and now I have my perfect seam where it's just singular right down the middle of my pot. So we can see the bottom's a little screwed up, so we can fix that in a second. But I'm going to select all these faces, and I'm going to start by making this proportional. So I personally like the freeform mode because the scale is great for just general scale, but you have to go into the submenu by holding down left click on the scale tool to go horizontally or vertically. But if we use the freeform, we can just grab the corner and stretch them any way we want. So this obviously proportionally needs to be wider, so I'm going to drag this wider. I'm going to hit F2 so that I can see what's going on. And I'm going to drag this until these squares look a little bit more proportional and nothing is stretching. So I think that looks pretty good. So now let's work on the bottom here. So let's select the edge that we think will be best hidden. So if I go to the front view here on my model, I want to pick a spot where we're not really going to see this if it was sitting on a surface. So kind of like the threshold between like here and here, because the stretching starts to happen around here, and if I start to even relax, it'll still have a little bit of stretching. So it's probably better to make a cut like right on this seam, either here or here. So I'm going to select that edge, and we can, unfortunately you can't double click in the viewport to select an edge loop in Max 2016. It's a little unfortunate. They did fix it in later iterations of 3ds Max, but until we update, you have to kind of live with it. However, you can double click inside the UVW editor, the Unwrap UVW editor. So just keep that in mind. If you do make a single click here, there is the edge loop button at the top of this modify panel on the right hand side, and you can either do loop or rings. So just keep that in mind. You can always click that guy. So now that we have our edge selected, we need to make it a seam. So we can go into tools and break, but get used to using the shortcut because it's kind of annoying. You're going to be making a lot of cuts and seams, so you're going to be using Control B a lot. So you might as well just learn the hotkey, and I'm going to hit Control B, and now we have this green line going through on our model and on the UVs. So if I turn on Select by Element UV toggle and select this bottom piece, and I want to hit F2 so I can actually demonstrate what I'm selecting here, I can move this down, and now I can do a separate projection method on this. If I try to just relax this, it's really not going to do any good because we have some odd seams on this. If you think about it, this is pretty easy to just do a top-down projection on it, a planar projection, and it'll look perfect. So this is why we're hiding the seam, because if we had a texture like this checker, we would kind of want it to be like perfect all the way around, but you've got to hide certain things so that we don't see those seams and cuts. So I'm going to select projection planar map, and it's already set to Z, which is great. One thing to note as well is since we're using something with letters and numbers, we could tell when this is backwards. So the UVs on this are actually flipped because we did a planar projection, but it was from the top down, not from the bottom up. So that causes issues. So what we can do is just click on this guy, move it down, right click, and go to, keep getting notifications, this is great. We can right click and go to flip horizontal. A better way to demonstrate this, if you weren't using some sort of map that told you that this was backwards, there's a number of ways you can display this in the viewport. But another thing to keep in mind is if we go to relax this, it's basically going to turn right inside out. So just to cover relax briefly, we're going to relax by polygon angles. This is typically the best practice. If you want it to go faster, you can lower the iterations and you can raise the amount, and it'll go extremely fast as far as unwrapping. But sometimes you want it to move slower if you're trying to make minor adjustments. So if I click Start Relax, we're going to see it's going to like turn inside out. It's going to start to look weird. That's typically a telltale that things are flipped inside out. Now, if I keep clicking this, eventually it's going to like work its way around and do this weird thing and finally unwrap and then expand again the right side out. But I know that this is messed up just from experience, so I'm going to flip this horizontally, and now I can relax and nothing happens because it's perfectly flattened out. Now, if I squish this a little bit and then I start to relax, it will actually relax to its true form. All right, perfect. So now let's move on to the handle here. So I'm going to turn on faces to make sure those are on, and I'm going to select this handle, and I got to decide whether I want the seam on the top or bottom. Typically you want to hide your seams, so I'm going to put it like on the inside here, and I think this spot's a great spot to use. So again, I'm going to click on that, and I can't really double click because it looks like we have some overlapping edges here. So I'm just going to use the loop edges button, and I'm going to hit Control B. Now that I have this already cut, I can lay it out nicely. So I can go to relax and start to work this out so that it will flatten out. Again, I want this to move pretty fast because this is a pretty simple shape. So I'm going to raise the amount, and I'm going to leave the iterations at 100, and I'm going to click Start Relax. It looks like we get a little bit of a kink here. So I'm going to try switching to edge angles. Sometimes that does the trick. Okay, and then switch back to polygon and let it work itself out. Now, this is just something you can like play around with going between the two. Typically polygon angles is what you want, but if something's really high poly, you'll notice that edge angles will work better in certain scenarios because otherwise it'll start to kink in areas where it's really dense geometry. So it's just something you need to mess around with on a per model basis. We'll be going over some other tools that you may find better, but this is definitely the more manual kind of touch and way to do UVs, but it's definitely a solid go-to because I won't run into any issues. I won't be guessing at values, and I kind of just can keep moving along. All right, speaking of moving along, let's go to the front spout here. I'm gonna make my seam. I'm gonna select the entire island, move it up here, and I need to create a seam. Now this one's a little bit harder because this is the front and then this is the inside, but we kind of see both equally. But I'm gonna make my cut right here, Control B, and I'm not gonna cut it just yet, but I'm probably gonna need some relief in this area. It's totally dependent on how close you're seeing it, but we're gonna get a little bit of stretching in this spot right here because it wraps down and the geometry goes inside down here, only for these like three faces here. So let's select this island and relax, and we'll see that we get this problem area right here. So this is what I'm talking about. When geometry is really close together, we can start to see some issues where things are overlapping. Typically going to edge and relaxing a little bit and then switching back to polygon, it will kind of work itself out. It's not really being that nice to me right now, so I'm going to go an amount of 0.1 so that it goes a little bit slower. You can try raising the iterations and go back to edge angles, let it work itself out a little bit. Now it's really not that bad from the outside, like it's kind of stretching how it should. Minimize this real quick. It's stretching almost how it should for its organic shape. But then we start to get these little spots in here, but honestly, it's starting to get really nitpicky, so it's forgivable. We could cut this seam right here to add some relief. So if I open up my UV editor, we can compare. I'm gonna hit Control B for break. I'm just gonna select, I'm gonna turn off select by element and select these areas right here. I'm going to deselect this spot because this is just our problem area, and I'm going to relax just those faces. I'm going to go back to polygon angle and see what that gives me. I'm going to select the next row because I want to just see if it helps out. It actually did a pretty good job. If we really wanted to see the detail, we could either increase the tile of our checker map, or we can just raise the size of this briefly, hit F2, and take a look at the area. It's really not too bad. So I'm going to leave that as is. I'm going to move this aside. We don't have to worry about scale. I'm going to go over that in a moment. And let's see here. Now we need to work with our top here. So this one's a little tricky in a certain way because we want to hide seams in strategic areas, but this one's a little on the difficult side just because we have this like isolated top just like the bottom of the teapot. So I'm just going to start with that. I'm going to make a cut, Control B. I'm just going to see if it will allow me to flatten this out. It didn't, so I'm just going to do another planar projection real quick. Turn that off. It's always going to go to the center here. I'm going to move that back up. That looks pretty good. But now I need to worry about this part. So it would be cool if I could make a seam all the way down and then kind of do like a revolve or something like that, but it's not really going to work that way, unfortunately. So I need to make another cut right here. So let's see. I'm going to just do an edge loop. I'm going to break it, and I'm going to make another loop somewhere. I kind of want to like have my seams in line. So I'm going to put another cut right here. And I'm just going to select these guys real quick, Control B, and I'm going to try flattening this out. All right, so it came out a little weird. We had some things going on. So I'm going to introduce this tool to you. It's the straighten selection. Since this is like, this geometry doesn't have any triangles, it's pretty much the same all the way through. It's very uniform. You could do a straighten on it, and it will actually make it perfectly straight, just like this revolve was for the base of the teapot. So we can click on this. I'm going to hit E for rotate, and I'm going to rotate this around. And I'm going to try relaxing a little. So we start to get these creases in here again, which is a little unfortunate. I really don't want to do that. So I'm going to increase the size so I can see a little bit better of what's going on. And these look fairly proportional. Again, like there's certain things we can't prevent without ruining the seam. Because if I start to relax this, we'll see on our seam, it just gets all screwed up. So that would be a lot more obvious versus this where it would kind of match up a little bit better. So I'm going to leave that just like that. And then we can do a planar projection again on our top here. Planar project and move this aside. Cool. So we obviously have some different scales going on right now. I obviously just did that one on purpose, but we have some different scale going on with our checker. And we want it all to be the same because if we put some sort of pattern or fabric material on this, we would really want everything to be lined up. So this is referred to as textile density. So we want to make sure that everything is exactly the same scale and size. Typically, Max is pretty good about it when it comes to working on an object like this, but it can be finicky at times. So just keep that in mind and make sure you're putting a checker map on it so that you can actually visually see what your problem areas are. So we don't really work with texture maps, but in this instance, like I might as well lay out my UVs just for the sake of getting everything to the proper textile density. Because if I go to pack together, it's going to rescale everything and make it proper sized based on every other piece. So it finds that average spot where it can fit all these together, but also make them all proper size. So if I just really make this one gigantic to make it pretty obvious, and I select everything in my UV editor by either dragging over everything or Control A, and I click pack together, it's going to pack everything together in a perfect square based on probably, it looks like it based it off of the largest piece, although this was pretty big, so I'm curious now. Yeah, it must base it off of just any given piece. I'm honestly not sure like what it's kind of picking as that textile density size. But if I decrease the size of this and then Control A and run it again, so it brought this piece back up. So it must find some sort of average because it did make these slightly smaller just now. Now, there's also this option, Pack Custom, and if you hold down on it and go down to the option box, and we kind of leave everything at default, we'll see normalize clusters as one of the options. So that's essentially what's going to make them proper size, like rescaling it and normalizing them. So we could set it to fill holes and rotate. I mean, it really doesn't matter unless you're working with wood because you need that wood grain to go in a specific direction. So I'm just going to click OK. It's going to put everything in this in my 0 to 1 space. And from that point, we can either leave it as is and set the material or the texture that we're using to scale more, or we can scale our UVs if we need to, if everything's already set up the way we want to. It really is up to you. It's probably a little bit of a better practice to adjust the tiling of your bitmap, but honestly, if you're working with a couple different objects and you only want to have one material instead of having multiple bitmaps with different tiles, then you might as well just adjust the UVs to match a little bit better to what you need. It's all circumstantial. So that's how you unwrap the teapot. And yeah, let us know if you have any questions. In the next video, we're going to be going over using quick peel mode. I'm not going to get into pelt map because it's honestly just like a weird tool to me. I'm not a huge fan of it. And I don't see the benefit of using it right now because we don't work with a ton of organic shapes. And we're also going to be going over how to make point-to-point seams, which is interesting.
So it's two different methods for doing the same thing, essentially. It's all about what works for you and what works for you in that situation.